Hi, Jim.
Hello, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm good. So hopefully Peter won't have any issues. I guess he never pre-registered.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
I guess we missed that step. Apologize.
Well, I think I've shared it a couple times, but
Yes.
he may have just thought he had already done it.
Absolutely.
So looks like we're waiting for Andrew to join.
Can you hear me?
Is that you, Andrew?
Andrew?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Andrew, there may be just a second or so delay with between your voice and your image.
Okay. I'm going to connect on my computer now.
Okay.
Welcome, Chelsea.
Hello.
I just made you co-host. Thank
All
you
right.
for
Thank you.
joining us tonight on your vacation.
Wow.
I know, dedication.
That sure is. Thank you, Chelsea.
No problem.
So at this point, we're waiting for Peter to join us. He had never pre-registered, and he wouldn't get the password unless he pre-registered. So
I sent him, well, he just sent out an email, and I essentially just copied and pasted the links that you sent me when I registered, I think.
yeah, it's sort of, because of security, everybody should use their own link. So I just wanted to make sure that he was pre-registered.
Can I try sharing my screen to make sure it's working?
Most definitely.
Okay, I'm doing it now.
Nothing yet. We can see your screen and can see that you're trying to open up a slideshow. Looks good. And I apologize. I have a
No,
delay.
you're getting the image. You're getting the image from the wrong.
You're right, we
The
are.
image yeah, okay, I'm gonna stop the share, because this is what I did last time, and I'm gonna share screen again. I'm gonna go for screen 2 this time.
Yeah, Cheryl, I'm hearing an echo on your end.
Yeah, I didn't realize my earplugs were plugged in. I undid it. So do you still hear the echo?
No.
Good. And Andrew, it looks
Okay.
good.
Okay, great. I'll stop sharing now.
All right. Looks like Peter is still not joined us.
Andrew, I'm wondering, could you shoot me a quick email or a private chat in this with Peter's number, and I'll give him a phone call just to check on him. Do you have that?
I'm not sure that I have it. Let me double check.
Okay, I'm gonna look also.
I sent him the link about 25 minutes ago,
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
but I can share it with him again.
And I just sent him the registration page link.
Okay, I have a work number for him. You want it?
Do private.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say if it's public, you can share it,
Yeah.
Okay.
or do it through private chat.
I'll email it to you.
Okay.
What's private chat? Yeah, let me just email it. I'm not that sophisticated.
Okay.
Damn, it just went away.
Let's see.
Cancel.
Oh, Peter, he's got his phone number on his email here, right here too. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Think about that.
You got it.
Yep. So I'm gonna go on mute for just a moment.
My beach outfit. I'm going to get off video now. I just wanted to show you my great dog shirt.
Nice.
Oh, nice.
Love it.
I may have left the beach approximately 10 minutes ago.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and hope that Peter joins us. And Chelsea can help too, Jim, if you need some technical issues while I'm doing like the intro, but we still have another 11 minutes before it starts. So plenty of time for Peter to join us.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Can anybody remind me of the order today?
Sherry's doing 5-minute logistics.
Yep.
Jim's doing 5 minutes of intro. Then I'm speaking for an hour. This is Andrew Carpenter. And then Peter's speaking for half an hour. We're going to leave at least 15 or 20 minutes for questions.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Everyone's still there?
Yep.
Yep, still here.
Okay. Just silent, so I wanted to double check.
Good
I'll
idea.
break in at the 5-minute marker to let anybody know who signed on early.
Okay.
So Peter Moon, it looks like you have joined us by video, and I'm not sure if you've joined us yet by audio. Peter Moon, could we-
Andrew, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Okay.
I was just
Hey,
about to ask. Thank you, Peter, for checking your audio.
It looks like we have the wrong title up there.
Oh, my apologies. I must have grabbed the wrong one.
Well, it's got our names on it.
Yeah.
Hi, Peter.
Hi. Is this Jim?
Andrew.
Oh, okay. I see Andrew. I see Jim is on board, and there are a number of others as well.
Yep. I'll join the group here. Here we go.
Okay.
And you're looking good, Jim.
Oh, well, thank you. Trying to stay well in these unusual times.
I'm going to oh,
So I'm just going to share. This is Cheryl Baldwin from Connecticut Deep. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to start the webinar in about 3 to 4 minutes. And if you are not one of the presenters, I ask that you stay on mute. Thank you. Peter, could you go ahead and mute yourself until you're presenting? Thank you. Thank you.
Do you want me to do the same?
Well, you're the first speaker, so you're fine. For some
Okay.
people, it just ensures that you're the one that's being viewed,
Okay.
because people have it on speaker, you know, viewing the speaker.
I wouldn't mind if they looked at Peter instead of me.
You can turn off your video if you want to, Andrew, if you're shy.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to announce that this is Cheryl Baldwin from Connecticut Deep. I see that some people are still wondering whether or not there's sound. At this point, nobody has started presenting. We're going to start the webinar in about a minute or two, so hold tight. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Cheryl Baldwin from Connecticut DEEP. I welcome you to today's webinar, part of the Connecticut Compost Webinar Series. Tonight is Compost Webinar number 4, Composting Feedstocks, Equipment, Siting, Infrastructure, and Management. This is going to be a great webinar with lots of information, so I hope you're ready. We have 2 wonderful speakers, as well as somebody who is moderating, Jim Hyde, who I will introduce in a moment. So again, this is part of the webinar series. We've had 3 webinars so far, and all the recordings have been put on the web page, on different web pages, which I'll show you in a minute. And then tonight, of course, is being recorded, and the next webinar after this is on October 28th from 4 to 6 p.m. hearing case studies about farm composting. We have a lot of sponsors to thank. While this is not an in-person conference as we anticipated, we very much appreciate all the sponsors and partners who have worked to put together this program. So today's program, all the attendees will be muted, both audio and video. We ask that you put any questions in the comment box or the chat box, which you can find if you move your mouse around. You should be able to see controls. Sometimes they appear on the side, sometimes above, and sometimes below, depending on what devices you're using. We ask you to use that chat function to type in any questions, and then the moderator will ask those questions of our presenters at the end. The webinars are being recorded. Connecticut DEEP is posting them on our webpage under Archived Municipal Recycling Coordinator e-news and webinars. And also Connecticut RC&D is posting them on their website as well under the Connecticut Compost Webinar Series. A disclaimer, DEEP is hosting the Connecticut Compost Webinar Series in part as professional development for municipal recycling leaders. Presentations do not constitute DEEP policy. Mention of trade names or commercial products do not constitute endorsement or recommendation of use. Links to non-DEEP websites do not imply any official DEEP endorsement of or responsibility for the opinions, ideas, data, or products presented at those locations or guarantee the validity of the information provided. Links to non-DEEP servers are provided solely as a pointer for information that might be useful to DEEP staff and the public. And so again, tonight is Composting Feedstocks, Equipment, Siting, Infrastructure, and Management. And I'd like to introduce Jim Hyde. Jim, do you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Cheryl. And thank you for all that you're doing behind the scenes to keep us moving. We have got a terrific series tonight. Very, very excited to welcome both Andrew and Peter to present to everyone this afternoon. Both well-respected guys with just a load of information to share. And so very excited that they're here. So without me getting in the way here, I would like to jump right into introductions. The format for this evening is going to be that we're going to go straight through presentations. We'll start with Andrew's presentation, and then we'll move directly into Peter's presentation immediately following that. After both presentations, there's going to be a question and answer session. So I'd like to encourage everyone during the presentations, as you have questions that come up, please write them into the chat box. And I will be taking those questions, grouping them into categories for each speaker, and then posting those questions to the speaker during our questions and answer session. So I would like to encourage everyone, when a question comes up, please put it in the chat box here on this Zoom meetings format, okay? So without further ado, I'm going to first introduce Andrew, and we'll listen to his talk, and then I will introduce Peter. First up is Andrew Carpenter, who is a certified soil scientist, a certified crop advisor, and a certified nutrient management planning specialist. Andrew received a Master's of Science from the University of Maine Department of Plant, Soil, and Environmental Science. Since 1992, Andrew has been recycling organic residuals and developing recycling programs for materials not historically recycled. In 2003, Andrew founded Northern Tilth, LLC, an environmental consulting firm focusing on organic waste management and building soil health. Andrew has extensive experience in research, planning, handling technical issues related to the reuse of many different organic residuals. In addition to running his business, consulting, advising, and research, Andrew is currently and actively involved with the Northeast Biosolids and Residuals Association, serving as both an active member and the treasurer. Andrew, over to you.
All right, I'm going to do my screen share. See if that works. Okay, do you see me? Is the first slide up from what you can tell?
First slide up.
Okay, great.
Feedstocks and equipment.
Yeah, I'll reiterate a couple things that Jim says. My favorite part of these talks is always the question and answer period, and we are planning to save plenty of time for questions and answers. So I do want you to, as we're both Peter and I are going through these, please write down your questions so we can address them at the end. It's a big set of topics: feedstocks, equipment, siting, infrastructure, and management. So we won't be able to go into great detail in all of them, but hopefully we'll give you a good kind of broad-based look at all of these things. So one thing that I think is really important, whether you're starting up a composting operation or you've already started one and are in the midst of one, is to remember to ask yourself what's your goal for your composting operation. In some cases, it's the product itself is the focus. So producing a high quality, marketable, finished compost that can be used for general distribution, maybe in a bag, maybe for bulk sales, but that is your focus, is that high quality compost. And we work with a wide range of clients, and including a lot of farms throughout New England, and a lot of them have on-farm composting operations. We work from really small operations to working with some very large municipalities throughout the country. So we've seen sort of everything. I'm guessing the audience here is tending more towards the smaller size, but a lot of the topics I'm going to cover are going to be relevant to all. So while some compost operations are focused on most specifically on the high quality end product, a lot of the ones that we work with are really focused on managing materials that they're generating, maybe on the farm or at the municipality. And so I just have to move this over there. In terms of your goals, they might, instead of being focused simply on the final product, they may be focused on material management. And in some cases, that might be managing a wet material, trying to make it drier, easier to manage, easier to apply to the soil. For a lot of the larger livestock operations we work with, there are naturally animal mortalities that happen on a regular basis, and composting is one of the most environmentally sound methods for managing mortalities on a farm. In some cases, actually, we run into this with beef operations a lot. If they're generating manure that has a lot of hay in it from the feed mixed with sort of spent feed, a lot of times we have farms that are composting it simply to break down the hay so that it's easier to spread in a solid manure spreader. In some cases, we have people that are generating really high carbon to nitrogen ratio materials, so very carbonaceous, low nitrogen that have the potential to tie up nitrogen if they're added to soil. In that case, composting can help minimize that nitrogen immobilization. And then there's, for working with manure, anything that has the potential to have pathogens in it, there's the issue of managing that material to make it pathogen free by achieving high temperatures during the composting process and essentially out-competing those pathogens, minimizing that population. So there's a huge array of potential reasons why you may be composting. In terms of models for composting, there's basically hundreds of potential different models. Two sort of extremes are tip fee-based composting operations where the model economically is getting most of your income from taking in a material that's otherwise might be headed for a landfill. So there's a tip fee avoidance from it going to a landfill. That tip fee can go to a composting operation that helps essentially drive or fund the composting process. The other extreme, again, is the focus on really high quality finished compost, in which case you may actually be going out and buying your feedstocks for your compost because it's worth it to you to make a really high quality compost that you can sell for a lot of, have a high per cubic yard sales price on it that you can actually afford to make the ideal blend of compost feedstocks to get that finished compost. In reality, most operations are a combination of the two. There are materials that people are wanting to manage, but at the same time, they want to increase the value of those materials in the composting process. I know that you all have been through composting basics. Because of the topics that we're going to cover, I just want to go over some of the basics again. I apologize if there's too much overlap with some of the other ones, but I'll try and go through this quickly. Essentially, the composting process is getting microbes to convert fresh organic matter to mature compost. And in order for the microbes to do that, they have similar requirements that we do, that humans, other animals do in their own metabolism, and that is getting sufficient supply of oxygen, a sufficient supply but not too much water, and having food in the form, the things we're most interested in the composting process are the carbon, degradable carbon and nitrogen itself to drive that metabolic process for the microbes. And as you can see on a microscopic scale, really all of that activity occurs in the areas within that composting pile that have some air, have a little bit of moisture, and have some of the food that's degradable and available to the microbes to oxidize. Additionally, after getting those parameters ideal, you also want to, typically you want a pH that's close to neutral. You want to have, you want to get the temperature up from the microbial metabolism, but you don't want to go too far out of whack. And when I talk about readily degradable organic material, it has to have essentially organic matter that is available to the microbes to oxidize. In terms of some of the parameters that are necessary for kind of the ideal conversion of organic matter to more stable humus or mature compost, having a moisture content between 50 to 60% in that blend of feedstocks is ideal. Not always achievable, and there are plenty of good composting operations that work outside of that range, but that's sort of an ideal. In terms of oxygen, you want typically between 5 to 10%. Also, people work outside of that range and compost effectively, but that's kind of the ideal. If you have too little air, the microbes, aerobic microbes won't thrive and anaerobic microbes will. Your pile can get smelly. And if there's not enough, they simply can't do they can't metabolize and do the work of oxidizing that organic matter. You want a mix of different particle sizes, ideally, and you need to have some porosity in there in order for the transfer of air. And you want a bulk density somewhere probably between 800 to 1,200 pounds per cubic yard. Although again, people do work outside of that range. Turning the piles is one of the things that helps introduce the oxygen to the piles. We'll talk about different methods for getting air in there. The amount, the blend of these things, the moisture, the good carbon to nitrogen ratio, the oxygen, porosity, and transfer of air, can be, you can get a feel for if it's ideal based on the temperatures that you're achieving in your pile. So over to the right, it's just a chart showing, and this is sort of idealized, but if you're turning it frequently, it's easier to get up to those kind of high end of the thermophilic range where you get some pretty fast conversion. If you turn less frequently, then you're not apt to get those higher levels. The composting process is likely to take longer. In terms of the carbon to nitrogen ratio, one of the easy ways to understand why this 20 to 1 or 30 to 20 to 1 to 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is ideal is the fact that microbes have their bodies are about 8 to 1 carbon, have about an 8 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And in doing the process of converting organic matter to stable forms, about 2/3 of the carbon is lost to the atmosphere, and another third is retained either in the final product or the microbial biomass. So if you start with a 24 to 1 ratio, you lose 2/3 of it. You get down to 8 to 1, which is about the same makeup of carbon to nitrogen in the microbial biomass that's doing the work. So we'll talk about blending a little bit, but obviously you've got some feedstocks out there that are very high in carbon, low in nitrogen, and some that are really nitrogen rich. And in order to drive that process or to get that ideal mix, you're going to have to come up with some kind of blend, unless you just happen to have the ideal mix to start with. Again, pH is somewhat critical, because if you're outside of the ideal range, then the microbial activity will shut down. There's typically a change over time during the composting process in pH. So even if you're starting with the ideal pH, you typically have a little bit of a drop during the first active phase, and then the pH tends to go up as the compost matures. In terms of, and you all have probably all heard about the thermophilic and the mesophilic range, but in the first phase of composting, where you're getting a lot of the conversion of that fresh organic matter to the more stable carbon, you can, that typically happens in the thermophilic range. Can happen in the mesophilic range, but it takes a lot longer. So thermophilic is up higher in above 45 degrees Celsius, and then the mesophilic range is below that. So the typical arc of the process is after making a good mix and aerating it, you get into that thermophilic range that can last a couple of weeks, even longer than that in some cases. And as you get sort of through that initial burst of easily oxidizable carbon, the process slows down a bit, get into mesophilic range, and it still takes a long time after that in that mesophilic range during the curing process to get to the point where the compost actually is mature and stable. Volatile solids is the same thing as organic matter, and you may see it on some tests as loss on ignition, or LOI, and it's simply the amount of material in a mass that does not combust when you try to combust at really high temperatures. But that's essentially the portion of whatever material is in the mix that's that the microbes have access to and can convert. One of the things too that, and this is a discussion with farmers, not necessarily with municipalities or people generating food waste, but there are cases where composting isn't necessarily the best fit for the material that you're working with, and it's very important to ask yourself before setting up an operation, is this really what I want to do with this material? I do find that there are people that assume that compost is the best form of organic matter out there to apply to soils, and I don't think that that's the case. If you're a farm generating manure and you're growing a lot of crops, and you're trying to displace your use of fertilizers, and you have a nitrogen-rich material, nitrogen-rich manure, it's often better in terms of reducing your fertilizer inputs to directly land apply that material and not compost it first. Part of the reason is as you compost material that does have nitrogen in it, the nitrogen gets converted to forms of nitrogen that are not only slow release, but they're released slowly over the course of decades as opposed to years. So you can have a nitrogen-rich material that if you applied, you can displace a lot of your nitrogen needs, and by composting it, you can greatly reduce the amount of plant available nitrogen that's in there. So that could be great depending on your goal, but in some cases it's not always. So it's a good thing to think about. What I have here is a table that shows nitrogen mineralization percentages, and I won't get into this in great detail, but other than to say that nitrogen in the form of proteins or organic nitrogen is not plant available. In order for that nitrogen, that organic nitrogen, to become available to plants, it has to go through microbially driven process to mineralize it to either nitrate or ammonium. And in nitrogen-rich materials, what this table shows is in the years after you apply that material, what % of that organic nitrogen is converted to plant available nitrogen. And you can see as you go down the list, further and further down the list, less of it is mineralized after applying it to the land. So composting of these that I've chosen provides the least. And this is painting compost with a broad brush, but essentially a lot of that activity that would occur after you directly land apply it to the soil, if you didn't compost it, is happening already in the compost pile, and it's tying it up into again longer term forms of nitrogen that won't provide you a lot of nitrogen over the first few years. Another thing in terms of nutrient management, if one does have a problem with excessive phosphorus levels, composting a material has the potential to exacerbate that problem, and I'll try to explain that as cleanly as possible. Essentially, chicken manure, beef manure, our own human manure has a ratio of phosphorus to nitrogen that's not really in balance with what most plants take up. typically crops take up about 1 unit of phosphorus for every 2 units of nitrogen. Whereas if you look at plant available nitrogen and plant available phosphorus in manures, there's a lot that balance is there's a lot more phosphorus than nitrogen. It doesn't fit that 1 to 2. It's more like 1.5 to 1, sometimes even 2 to 1. During the composting process, as I mentioned, you reduce nitrogen availability a bit, but the phosphorus is essentially conserved in the process. So if you already have a problem with excessive phosphorus levels in your soil and you still want to use that compost to get a significant charge of nitrogen, you have to add even more of it to get the same amount of nitrogen, and you're going to overdo it potentially with phosphorus. This is not to say that composting is not good, because in so many cases it's a great thing to do, but it's just another thing that another item to consider when you're considering composting. If we look at this from the perspective of sort of carbon cycling in soil, when you add fresh organic matter, can you guys, I don't think, yeah, give me a cursor. You add fresh organic matter to soil, it has some organic carbon in it, it's got organic nitrogen in it, and the microbes are very happy. You add it to the soil, they oxidize that organic carbon. That's where they get their energy for metabolism. They use up some of the nitrogen, but they'll also mineralize some to make it plant available. And ultimately, like I said, 2/3 of the carbon goes off to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Another third or so is in the soil humus and the microbial biomass. When you add when you add a manure, let's say, to soil, this is what happens. It also happens in the composting process prior. If you compost beforehand, then essentially you're doing this in the compost pile instead of the soil. So if you look at it from the perspective of adding carbon to soil, there should be not much of a difference between the two. In one case, you're having the bugs do the work in the soil. In the other case, you're having that happen in the compost pile before you add it to soil. So in terms of soil health, it can be sort of a wash. I mean, there are other benefits from the composting, but I only bring this up because I think it is important, especially from the perspective of farms, to determine, do you really want to compost or not? But so let's get on to composting technologies. In terms of, there's hundreds of ways really to have that conversion from fresh organic matter to mature compost. The sort of the archetypal one that people often, if they're not in this every day, think of is windrows of material that get turned on a periodic basis. So in this case, you're making a feedstock blend, you put it out in windrows, you turn those windrows periodically in order to reintroduce oxygen, because as the microbes are oxidizing the organic matter, they're essentially using up the oxygen that's available to them. So you want to incorporate or add more air from time to time. So windrow turning is, again, kind of what people often think of when they think of composting. It's sort of conceptually, it's easy to think of. There are hundreds of ways, again, to turn these piles, but this is one sort of big method for composting. There's also static piles, which is just like it sounds, and that is just making a nice blend of feedstock and letting the material sit in piles. And some people swear by this. It's not the kind of thing that you often see in compost textbooks. You can imagine there's a lack of aeration typically in a pile that's sitting there statically. But some people are very successful with it. If you have a lot of time, you're not in a hurry to get that material composted, and you do have the right blend, and maybe you turn the pile once every 6 months or something like that, you can actually get a fairly good compost from it. But it makes the process a lot longer. And then this is what Peter's going to talk a lot about, so I won't try to get into it too much, which is aerated static piles. And that is, instead of turning the piles to introduce oxygen to them, you make your compost blend, and you push air, either push air through the piles or pull air through the piles. You can do either, and some operations do a combination of both. They have what's called positive air, where you're pushing it through, and negative air, where they're pulling it through. It can be very, very simple, simply with pipes that have holes in them in the bottom of a bunker that you then lay your compost blend on top of, usually some wood chips maybe right on top of the pipes, and then have blowers that blow air through the pipes. So it can be very simple. It's in a way, it's elegant in that it takes up very little space. I'll talk about that in a minute. But so this is a lot of the larger compost facilities use aerated static piles. It's a very proven technology. This is just another picture of one. Oftentimes they're in a bigger, larger system. There are several bays, sometimes hundreds of them. Oftentimes they're separated by walls. It's different cells. Sometimes they're just butt up right next to each other. But again, the idea is you make your compost blend, you put it in your bin, your aerated static pile bin. You either push air through it, pull air from it for aeration, and you can leave it there for essentially that first active phase of composting, and then typically you will remove it for curing for some time. But Peter's going to get in depth into that. There are so many different composting systems, but another sort of class of them is in vessel. This one on the left here is the Lewiston Auburn Water Pollution Control Authority. It's a biosolids composting operation there. This is a really old system that lasted for quite a while. And it is a combination of beds in which the feedstock is blended into, and this big sort of moving rototiller that goes on tracks above the bay and goes down, I think it's once a day, and turns the material and also pushes it towards the back end. And I don't remember the residence time in there. I think it's maybe 12 days, but I can't be sure. But essentially, it's plug flow. So you introduce the feedstock in the front end, and as this thing's going over it on some frequency, it's pushing the material, the older material, towards the back end. This is a drum composter. I actually haven't seen them much, and then recently, and now I have two clients that use them, and are both very happy with them. This one is at a septic composting facility in Maine. The residents, again, you're feeding it from one end, it's coming out the other end, so it is also plug flow. And it's the residence time in these is short, usually 3 to 5 days. Temperatures, you get high temperatures very quickly in them, so you can get through your first phase of composting where you're doing pathogen reduction, getting those thermophilic temperatures really quickly, and then it goes out to curing for some time. You know, a lot of systems are really a hybrid of a bunch of different types of composting. In this case, it's just this one on the left here is on-farm composting of manure. They have a windrow turner, but they also cover the material with a permeable fabric that does shed water. This is some people I know out in the Pacific Northwest, now in Washington, that have a combination of aerated static pile. So these big slabs actually have aeration tubes built into the slabs, but they also turn those piles while they're being aerated. So it's a combination of turning and aerated static pile. And then you see, I've just seen so many different innovations on farms and smaller operations that you couldn't really even explain necessarily, but still work well. In terms of advantages and disadvantages, one obvious one is, and I'm sure Peter may talk about this, but aerated static pile systems have a much smaller footprint than windrow systems, typically a quarter of the size, sometimes even a greater reduction in space than that. This is an operation that I worked with in Massachusetts that started working with them, had an outdoor manure composting windrow operation. Took up a lot of land, and they really did need to. There were some runoff issues associated with it, nothing bad, but they really wanted to improve the operation. As you can see, in the winter, it was in mud season, it's very hard to manage. Ultimately, we were able to get funding through the NRCS to cover the system and transform it into an aerated static pile system, and literally did get down to about a quarter of the space of the original footprint, maybe even a little more than that. So you don't have to run equipment through the rows. You can build the piles a little bit higher, and in this case, it became small enough that it was actually affordable with some grants from the NRCS to cover the system. So that in the Northeast, that's a big benefit too, because we get so much rain. Windrow systems. Sorry, let me go back up. And one of the things we did find in this case is he did not have an ideal mix of feedstock. It was relatively dense, not a lot of porosity. It was manure coming from a freestall barn that was bedded with sand. And windrow, from my experience, windrow composting and turning windrows gives you a little bit more flexibility in what your feedstocks can be. You sort of go outside the ideal range and still make it work. It's a little tougher, and this is a lesson we learned in this case with the aerated static pile. We really had to change the recipe significantly from this first one to the second one to get an even flow of air through the piles. In-vessel systems can have an even smaller footprint and a shorter residence time for the compost to get through that initial phase. And for that reason, a lot of bigger facilities that are, especially ones that are tip feed driven, have the opportunity and incentives to get quicker turnaround time and have the ability to pay for these larger in-vessel systems that have a shorter period of time and a much smaller footprint than they would otherwise need. Not typically the case for, most of the smaller operations on farms that I've worked with wouldn't be as interested in spending the money for an in-vessel system. Not out of the question, but not as typical. In terms of windrow turning, the equipment varies from things that are readily available on farms. A lot of people that we work with turn their piles with skid steers, front end loaders, or excavators. As they get a little bigger, farms, there are drag behind, tow behind windrow turners that run off PTO on a tractor. And then when you get into larger operations, there's again a huge sort of assortment of potential vehicles. This is one that as it flips the windrow, it turns the windrow. It actually moves the windrow as well. The scarab here just straddles the windrow itself and turns it as it goes. All of them essentially doing the same thing, which is after you get the good mix and a windrow set up, you need to incorporate air occasionally in order to continue to drive that microbial oxidation process. In terms of equipment, I'll let Peter get into this. I'm sure could run tight for time, so I'll only say that the equipment is relatively simple for the aerated static piles. The arrangement of the equipment is something that you need to put a lot of thought into, but it's simply blowers that blow air through the systems, usually through the bottom, sometimes in tracks that are in concrete below the floor of the bins, and sometimes it's simply PVC pipes that you lay out by hand before you load the piles to the bunkers. for the bays. There are fabric cover systems. They're relatively expensive, but they, Gore in particular makes a fabric covered system, which is sort of a hybrid. It's aerated static piles. You're blowing air through the piles, but they're covered with this permeable Gore-Tex fabric, which helps you retain, in some cases, moisture, or if you in an area that gets too much moisture, it helps shed the moisture. The Gore system comes with this fancy, I don't even know what you call the machine, but it unrolls and rolls the material as it straddles it. It's pretty hard, even in a small farm, to have a fabric covered system, because it does take a lot of effort to remove and replace those covers. In terms of equipment for both before, when you're making the pile, and then the finished pile is, hundreds and hundreds of options. Most bigger facilities have mixers into which they'll load the feedstocks and have the blending occur in there before they either build their windrows or load their bays. A lot of smaller operations will just do it with a skid steer front end loader. In terms of screening, there's all manner of screens. This one is an orbital screen. This is actually the same farm. They went from this orbital screen to a trommel screen, which sends the overs out this way and the finished compost out this way. It's fed here. And then these are a couple on-farm innovations to allow for relatively inexpensive screening of the finished product. This portion applies more to bigger facilities, but I think anyone getting into food waste and curbside collection of source separated organics needs to be prepared for physical contaminants, and especially as the programs grow, being able to manage a material that is going to have some contamination. So this is a facility I went to out in California that takes material from San Francisco's curbside program. They actually, before going into composting, they have a pick line for picking out bags, any kind of contaminants. And then this is that same operation in Oregon that I showed a picture of before. They've gotten large enough where it's actually cost effective for them to have a pick line as well. They're getting a lot of material from the Portland, Oregon curbside collection program. There are now, it's more common to see facilities, more for anaerobic digestion facilities, is having mechanical separators or depackagers. These are pretty expensive, but they're slick in that you can get materials from supermarkets that are sort of out of date materials that are still packaged. While it's sort of mechanically kind of simple, it's incredible how effective these separators are at separating out. They can even take food out of cans, separate food from cans and plastics and bottles, and it's a neat process, but more for bigger facilities. At that same facility out in Oregon, another thing that they do is actually when they get a contract with a city that's providing them source separated organics, they have a penalty per the amount of physical contaminants that they find in the loads that's coming in. So it provides an incentive for whoever is providing them the material to take it out beforehand. And then there are adaptations to screeners that have a vacuum on them, so that plastics are a pain in the butt for anybody that's doing that's composting curbside collected organics. It's unavoidable. This is one way to get that the sort of film plastic out after the fact during the screening process. So it separates it into these bags. Oops. Sorry, I'm gonna. I can tell based on what I have left, and knowing that I want to leave plenty of time for Peter and questions. I'm not even going to go into biofilters. They want to get into siting considerations. And I just want to emphasize and overemphasize how important it is when planning a process to take into account neighbors and odors and the combination of the two. It's amazing to me how many composting operations that I've seen that are well run otherwise have problems with neighbors and odors and go out of business. So you really can't overemphasize that. Working with your neighbors up front is really important. Having a good relationship with them is. Also taking into account visual screens, because it is the case that people, there's a term out there that people smell with their eyes. They don't really, but essentially there's a perception that goes along with seeing a pile that can make the odor seem worse. But also taking into account prevailing winds and what your feedstocks are going to be, how smelly your process is going to be. Can't really overemphasize that. And working with the neighbors up front before you set up a system is really important. It's often a hard thing to do because you're opening up a can of worms potentially, but it typically pays dividends when you do have that relationship. In terms of environmental protection, in the Northeast, we have different conditions and different constraints than, say, people that are doing composting in arid parts of the country. We often get too much moisture in the form of precipitation, and that often it leads to leachate coming out of the bottom of the piles or getting run on. If you're located such that you have a lot of upstream or upslope surface water coming down, it can be a real problem. So it's a consideration you need to take into account. How wet is the combination of feedstocks that you have. Are you going to have leachate? And if so, do you have an area to send that leachate, either in the form of a pond, a vegetated treatment area? Are you able to soak it up with dry material, which we do have some people doing? And then, if you can afford to and it makes sense, considering covering the operation. Again, it's really important to emphasize how you're located geographically. Are you getting a lot of upslope surface runoff onto the piles, and do you have a place to direct any flow that hits the pile? Can you divert the water that's maybe upslope of it around your composting facility? But these are things you want to take into account. It's always good to look at your facility in the worst possible conditions, which around here is typically April or March when we're in mud season. That's going to give you a really good indication of, am I going to have problems in this location or not? It's also important to take advantage of topography and in your movement of equipment. If you start the process up high, and as you go through the process, either going from blending down into your bays or your windrows, it's easier if you're going down during that process, if you're pushing the material down. And then into curing as well, as opposed to having to pick the material up and move it upslope, which is it's more of an effort for you and the equipment. And minimizing the amount of movements that you make, so that if you have things in sort of series, as opposed to having to move from one end of your site to the other end when you're doing curing. It can eat into your profits quickly. Another thing to take into account, especially for smaller operations where the composting is a side project, is proximity to where you are during the day. And we were just at this farm a couple days ago. They have a composting operation. It's a dairy that's on the other side of the road and through the woods from the main production area where they spend most of the time. And even this little distance is enough. They told us that they sort of forget about the composting. It's not right in front of them, so it's not obvious when things need to be turned, when there are problems associated with it that they need to fix, that kind of thing. There are a lot of people out there that can help you in terms of designing your operation, but again, it's really important to have a plan of sort of at least a conceptual layout of how things are going to work while minimizing your movement of material during the composting process. And for us in the Northeast, making sure that if it's a system that is out in the open, that you have a place where the water is running to and can collect and either treat or hold for a period of time, keep it out of low-lying wet areas, and keep it out of water bodies. I put a short plug in here for the Maine Compost School, which they haven't been having during COVID, but they've had for I think 20 or so years now, a few times a year. It's a great 4-day, I think, compost school I went to. A bunch of my employees have gone to. It's really helpful. They help you with the process of identifying what feedstocks might go with other feedstocks. But essentially, ultimately, you're going to have to make a blend that has a good carbon to nitrogen ratio, gets you somewhere in that ideal moisture content. You have some porosity. The bulk density isn't too high or too low. And there's plenty of volatile solids or organic matter in there for the microbes to feed on, and the pH isn't super out of whack. I think everybody who works on composting has their own spreadsheet or some kind of calculator that helps you determine what good feedstocks might get you into that down here, the good sort of range of carbon to nitrogen ratio, solids content, bulk density. This is the one we use. This compost, you can see, is actually not, it's a little more moist than one might like. It's a little low in the C/N ratio, a little low in the bulk density even, but this happens to be a really good blend. Like I say, it can get outside of those ideal ranges and still make a good compost in some cases. But it's always really important to take into account the moisture content of your material and sort of physical qualities of it, porosity, that kind of thing. In terms of the organic matter content, there is a difference, and not all carbon is equal or the same. So a loss on ignition test doesn't necessarily tell you everything. And this is just sort of a range of, in food waste, the carbon that's in there is typically readily degradable, quick to break down, easily to access for the microbes. In bedded horse manure, it tends to be a little less so, but also still really good. Easy for the microbes to oxidize. When you get into woody debris, it gets a little less so. It's got a higher lignin content. The process of breaking that down goes a lot slower. If it's real fine, like sawdust, typically does pretty well, but it's going to be slower than some of these other things. And then when you get up into wood chips, you can adjust your C/N ratio with wood chips so it gets in the ideal range. But in actuality, so much of that carbon is in the center of those wood chips. It's really not that accessible to the bug. So C/N alone doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story. I do want to emphasize for people that are getting into, interested in getting into food waste composting, again, the issue of contamination is something that can be managed, but it's always there to some extent, and really important to plan for it. Make sure that you have the ability to deal with some contamination, and that could be through the process of screening it, before it comes into the facility. It could be some of those options that I showed before, maybe removing it after the fact with a vacuum. And maybe you have more tolerance in terms of your marketing for a material. Maybe it's a material that isn't sold for quite as much, and so the customers have some tolerance for the contamination that's in there. But it's good to plan for if you're providing containers to an institution, food processing place. It's important to train the staff and make sure that the containers are really well marked. It's very easy for people to throw trash into containers that are marked for food waste if they're not paying close attention. But as we get better and better, and you see this out in California, as we get better and better with diverting food waste from the solid waste stream to recycling and composting, we essentially get into more and more potential for contamination. Hang on a sec. Oh, I want to make sure. I'm going to skip past this because I do want to make sure I'm giving time for everything. One thing that I think is really important is not getting too hung up on a lot of the theory that goes into composting. It's important. It's really important to help you plan the process and help you troubleshoot. But there are, like I say, a lot of composting operations that are successful, that work outside of their feedstock blend doesn't fit right into those ideal ranges, and they still do a good job. And that's why I say composting theory is good, but it will only get you so far. And the composting process is really kind of a mystical process, a combination of microbiology, chemistry, physical properties, and not everything can sort of be explained on paper. So from that, I think it's important to recognize that your own experience with compost recipe development and managing your piles is from your own trial and error processes can be as valuable, if not more so, than compost theory. They're both very important. When we're helping someone troubleshoot composting problems, I'm a big fan of trying new blends and feedstock blends to at least try and drill down into what is the constraint in the composting process. And in doing so, I usually recommend big changes as opposed to subtle ones. So for instance, if you're having trouble getting up to temperature with a blend of 2-to-1 wood chips to chicken manure, and you suspect that it's because of porosity, not getting enough airflow through there, my recommendation would be to go to 4-to-1 in a small pile, not 2.5-to-1. And at least, even if that's not going to be your final blend, it will help you determine if that is in fact a problem or if it's something else altogether. In terms of your feedstock and what you're going to need to purchase, this sort of goes back to what your ultimate goals are. If it's just material management, any one of the sort of material management options we mentioned at the beginning, then you're not going to want to spend a whole lot of money on feedstocks. You're going to want to find the cheapest option out there available to get your compost pile to cook. On the other end, if your goal is really producing the high value material that you might put in a bag and someone could use in any setting, and it would still be a good material for them, you may go out and want to purchase fairly expensive inputs just to make sure that the composting process is driven well, and you end up having a good balance of nutrients and pH when it's done. So you have a good nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium balance. It's homogeneous. It looks good in a relatively small particle size. So It's also important, I think, to be very realistic about the feedstocks that you choose. Horse manure, from my experience, is very forgiving. It happens to be a pretty porous, typically it's a relatively porous blend with a relatively good seed-end ratio, maybe a little high, but on its own will compost pretty well without much in the way of inputs. On the other hand, chicken manure, seafood waste, food waste, and materials that are really nitrogen rich and moist, you want to be realistic about how much of a structural agent or carbon amendment you're going to need to buy, because it can often, it affects not only the cost of composting, but it affects the size of your operation, because you may literally need three times as much amendment as your sort of the main feedstock that you're managing. You know, once you have gone through this process, blend your feedstocks, aerate them, and as homogeneously as possible. Build your piles, aerate through whatever system you're using. I'm a big fan of monitoring temperature, even in small composting projects, to get an idea, to get feedback on how the microbes are doing and what help they might need. And to monitor odor, which gives you a sense of, are things going anaerobic, or are they cooking along like they should? And then refine the recipe and your management as needed through trial and error. So actually, that's the end of my portion. I did want to put also a plug in for a compost sampling video that we put together for the Composting Council's Research and Education Foundation. It's on YouTube at this point, and it's sort of there are two videos. The first one is for typical compost sampling and analysis, both the collection and sending it out to the lab and what to get it tested for, and the second one for kind of more esoteric things that you might be testing for in compost. And I'll end it there.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. Appreciate all that information. That hour flew by for me. I certainly appreciate all that. I have been collecting questions here for you. I've got a list of questions, and I'm hoping that more questions will come in too. So don't be shy. Go ahead and send in your questions in. I'm going to collect them, and then we'll have a specific question and answer session at the end. So without further ado, we'd like to get into the second presentation for this afternoon, and that is going to be from Peter Moon. Peter, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute, I will introduce you.
There we go.
Wonderful. All right. So this is Peter Moon. Peter Moon is a licensed civil and environmental engineer in the wonderful state of Washington. Peter founded O2 Compost in 1996, where the primary focus of the business was to design on-farm compost systems to help manage manure from livestock operations and zoos. Over the years, the same composting principles have been applied to all varieties of organic wastes, including landscape debris, biosolids, different sources of food waste, including industrial, commercial, and post-consumer waste streams. Peter's company specializes in designing small, medium, and large-scale compost systems. They provide everything from engineering consultation, general site layout, permitting, to operator training. They serve both private and public sector clients, such as universities, city and county municipalities, corporations, corrections, and military institutions. In all, O2 Compost has helped develop over 1,500 compost systems throughout the United States, Canada, and 26 additional countries. Without further ado, Peter Moon.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here. As a reference, I am not in Connecticut, actually. I'm in the Seattle, Washington area. So 3 hours behind you. And it was really interesting to listen to Andrew. He and I have both done quite a bit of teaching on this topic. And while the conversation is very much the same. The content is the same. I found it fascinating to hear someone using different words. I learned a lot, and look forward to following up on some of his references. I'm going to try to share my screen here. This may be a bit fussy. And Jim, you tell me if we're on track, but this should show you the page on-site composting using aerated static pile methods. Is that what you're seeing?
Coming up loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. So as with Andrew, I have worked with every method of composting, every scale of operation, and ostensibly every type of feedstock known to man, including mortalities and so forth. And just as a reference point, in Washington State, it is now legal to compost human remains, and I'm working on a project where we are designing a facility specific to that. So I never thought I'd see that, but we are using an aerated static pile method, and this talk is focused specifically on ASP composting as a method of managing all varieties of organic waste on a variety of different scales, which I will be showing you examples of. See if I can maneuver this. And so very quickly, we're taking any variety of organic wastes. In this picture, you're seeing food waste, and we are, our goal is to produce a high quality soil amendment, compost. We do this using a method referred to as aerated static pile composting, or ASP composting. This is a picture of a horse farm in California. Basically, it looks like a big meatloaf out in the field, but you can see there are aeration pipes, and in the doghouse there is a blower which induces airflow into the pile. So with ASP composting, what we can achieve is conduct a compost pile, or construct a compost pile over a network of aeration pipes and induce airflow into the pile using an electric blower that is, in its most simplest form, operated by a timer, an on-off cycle timer. We don't turn the pile during the first 21 to 30 days, what we refer to as the active phase of composting, active phase being mostly a bacterial-driven process. And we're able to adjust the airflow to manage pile temperatures and optimize the biology of the composting process. And we can operate the blower either using grid power, which is most typical, or it can be operated solar power as well, which I have a couple of examples of here as we go through. So looking at a cross-section of an aerated static pile in its most simplest form, we first have pipe that's on the ground, and part of this pipe, the manifold, is solid pipe, but the portion that's directly beneath the pile is perforated pipe where airflow comes out. And we use, in our pilot projects to get started, most easily acceptable or accessible and least cost thin wall pipe, PVC or HDPE, thin wall HDPE. But when we go to this strategy for the long haul, we typically will upgrade that pipe to thick wall HDPE, which can be used over and over and over again. So in this example, we're showing pipe on grade. This same thing can be done with trenches built into the concrete slab, and that's eliminates the need to handle pipe. But when you do this, those trenches also serve as drains. And so there's a little bit more engineering that gets involved in that process. For this example, we're going to go with pipe on grade. Over the top of the pipe, we place a layer of wood chips, or in some cases, the screen overs, the material that comes off the top of the screen that is very, very porous. We put this over the pipe to allow for airflow across the base of the pipe, or across the base of the pile rather, and then under pressure, it then goes up into the pile. You'll notice that the aeration plenum layer does not extend out to the sides, and this is to prevent short circuiting of the airflow. Over the top of the plenum layer, we construct our pile. And as Andrew has described, we're looking at an initial mix with a balanced C to N ratio, a certain bulk density, and moisture content. These are the three drivers for any compost mix. And he mentioned pH. On occasion, especially with food waste, pH does or can be an issue, but primarily it's carbon to nitrogen ratio, bulk density, and moisture content. And over the top of the mix, once we've constructed the pile, we put a layer of unscreened compost to serve as our biofilter cover. The two primary reasons for this is to insulate all of the raw mix such that it comes up to 55 degrees Celsius or 131 degrees Fahrenheit, the two are equivalent, for a minimum of 3 days to achieve the criteria for a process to further reduce pathogens, or PFRP. This layer also serves as a biofilter layer such that any of the off gases, volatile organic compounds, ammonia, some of the greenhouse gases will get absorbed in this layer and will be treated by the biology, the biota in that layer in situ, such that what comes off the top of the pile has a very, very mild organic fragrance that tends to dissipate pretty quickly. For biofiltration, these layers are practically miraculous. In addition to that, it helps retain nutrients, specifically nitrogen. If we're retaining ammonia in the system, we're also retaining nitrogen. It helps as a vector barrier such that rodents and birds and flies and anything that wants to get into the mix to get food, the opportunistic wildlife, can't do it because once they dig down a few inches, it gets too hot and dissuades them any further digging. It helps to retain moisture. Moisture is really the key factor of those three primary parameters. Moisture is really the key to managing the composting process. And with a pile like this, because we're not turning it, we're not able to wet it down. So we start at a somewhat higher moisture content, typically 60 to 65%, in an effort to keep that moisture content above 50% through that 30 days of composting. We can irrigate the top of the pile, but by doing that, we're only wetting the top 6 to 8, maybe 10 inches of material, which serves the biofiltration process, but it won't help us to adjust the mix internal to that pile. And then the last thing it does is it improves the aesthetics. You heard Andrew mention people smell with their eyes. If they come out to a site and see a compost pile that's very tidy, good housekeeping, everything, no visible feedstock showing, they will be much more inclined to not have a problem with your operation. And as he said, as Andrew said, it's really important to get to know your neighbors and pay attention to any of their concerns. So this is an example of a partially constructed aerated static pile. This is at one of our workshops. You can see here our power source. This is our timer, operates the blower. In this case, we're using a very simple and inexpensive high-impact plastic blower that's most commonly used for inflatable toys, jumpy houses, that sort of thing. The air is delivered into this manifold, which delivers that airflow to 4 respective pipes. You'll see here we're going from 6-inch to 4-inch pipe, and then this stretch of pipe is solid. Beneath the wood chips is perforated, and then we come out the far end of the pile with more solid pipe and a cap. The cap allows us to drain the pipe should any excess water get in there, but it also helps us see where the pipe is when it comes time to break that pile back down. In this case, it's incomplete. This is shredded yard waste. And once this pile is constructed, then we would put finished compost over the top of it, again, to serve as our thermal layer and biofilter layer. Now I'm going to show you a number of examples, starting with the smallest. This is something that we sell, is what we call our micro bin system. On the left is a simple plywood box, 2 sheets of 3/4 inch plywood cut in half to form 4 4-foot by 4-foot panels, holds about 2.5 cubic yards. We're using here a 1/4 horsepower blower and a very simple cycle timer. This is the same size system using tongue and groove lumber. It's a little more durable over the long haul, but it functions every bit as well. Here's an example of a microbin system where the bins have been conjoined. This is in New Haven, Connecticut at Domingo Medina's site, Phoenix Press Farm. Very successful operation. Here's a somewhat larger system that's built into a hillside. This is we refer to as a top-down system, where the material is delivered from the high side, composted, and then ultimately removed from the low side 30 to 45 days later. Here's another example of a top-down system, this being in Sterling, Massachusetts. This is a 16-horse farm. I should mention that we have done a lot of compost systems worldwide, as Jim mentioned, 1,500 plus. And the vast majority of those are on-farm systems, and most of those are horse farms. So I like Andrew, have a lot of experience with horse manure. Here's a compost system. This is a 4-bin system in New Hartford, Connecticut. You can see they're getting somewhat larger as we go through this sequence. Here's a facility in Ojai, California, Southern California, south of Santa Barbara. This is a resident high school where each of the students has their own horse, and they're combining horse manure, yard waste, food waste from the cafeteria in this system. And this is one example that is solar powered. So you can see here we got the photovoltaic panel. Here's all the apparatus to convert direct current into stored energy in the batteries, and then into AC current to operate the blower. Here's an example of a freestanding aerated static pile. This is the simplest, most readily available form of ASP composting, this one being in Pennsylvania. And here's another example of New England compost in Bethel, Connecticut. This is a pile that's being constructed. And here you can see this black pipe is thick wall HDPE, which is literally pulled out from under the pile when the pile is getting ready to break down. The left portion of the pile, although it's under construction, can be aerated as the pile is being constructed. And here's another picture of that same facility. It too is a solar powered facility. Very, very successful. So if you're in that area, I would encourage you to find New England Compost and pay them a visit. One thing that we can do with individual piles is continue to build onto the advancing flank of that pile and add pipe as we go and add blowers. So in this particular example, this is referred to as an extended aerated static pile. There are 3 blowers, so there are 3 aeration zones. There's a PVC manifold. There's flex tube hose to connect to the thick wall HDPE pipe. These pipes are 80 feet in length, 2 40-foot sections per pile, or per pipe rather, and connected with a simple rubber fitting in the middle. So when this is broken down, Ned Foley, the owner operator, pulls the pipe out the left direction and in the right direction to free up the material so he can harvest it. So you can see the scalability of this, of the system. So this is an image, and I'm going to change for the moment to, see if I can do this. Jim, confirm that you see this. This is a, can you see this?
Okay. Yep, looks good.
Okay. Okay, great. So I work with a lot of startup compost operations, and to convey the siting and design, facility design, what I did was I took a 1 acre piece of ground and added to it and created a square, and then to that all the different operational areas that need to be taken into consideration. So off to the left, you see this is a list of the various operating areas and accoutrements to that site, and it relates to the letters in each. In this particular case, this would be the high point, this would be the low point, and we have a leachate collection pond down here. We have run off or trenches to prevent run on, rather, but we're also collecting any water that's coming off the site and directing it here. This is a receiving area. This is our screen overs and bulking material. This is our mixing area. This is our primary active composting area, which transitions to a curing area, and then ultimately to a product storage area. In this, we have a gray zone, which is where the public has access to. It's important to keep the public separate from your operations for safety reasons primarily. And in this case, they can drop off here and pick up compost and then leave the site. In this spreadsheet, I have, and then off to the side while we're here, a list of typical operating equipment. And I made a few recommendations here simply as a starting point for a facility of this scale. The equipment that I've cited here would not be suitable for a much larger scale system, while all of these areas should be considered. This equipment is suited to a 1 to 2 acre type facility. In this spreadsheet, I've also included a very, very simplified mass balance analysis, such that if we're bringing in 4,500 tons per year of material, we can expect to plus or minus produce 320 cubic yards per month on an average basis. If we change this number, for example, the yellow cells are assumed values, and the green cells are calculated values, but let's say we change that to 10,000, then everything else in the system changes as a function of these assumed values. And below, and then there's also another tool that I've created, which is a pile sizing tool. If we have, in this case, a pile that's 8 feet high, 40 feet long, 50 feet wide, we have a volume of about 400 cubic yards. If I change this length to say 75 feet, then that volume goes to 840 plus or minus cubic yards. This number is the number of cubic yards it would take to cover that pile with finished compost, assuming that that pile is a foot thick. So now going back to, I'll minimize that. And what I should say is I'm more than happy to share that spreadsheet with you if you like. All you need to do is contact me, and I'll give you that information here shortly. But in summary, by inducing airflow into the compost pile, we're able to maintain aerobic conditions throughout the active phase of composting without turning the pile. That saves a tremendous amount of time and energy and equipment, labor, fuel, everything. It optimizes the biology of the composting process. We're able to manage temperatures and expedite the rate of composting and reduce the operating footprint during the active composting phase. And I agree with Andrew, at least by 75%. Depending on the type of windrow turner that you're using, you can save a considerable amount more space if you need to. We're also able to reduce offensive odors and offsite impacts during that active phase of composting, eliminate pathogens, parasites, weed seeds in the finished product, minimize vector attraction, flies, rodents, and birds, and produce a high quality compost product at a lower cost. And so that, I think, will sum it up. Here's my contact information. If you are interested in that spreadsheet, I'd be more than happy to share it with you. And if you have any questions about how we approach things, I'm always available by phone or Zoom or whatever. This is what I do. So I will turn this back to Jim and Cheryl and look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much, Peter. So we are going to go into a question and answer session. I'm going to delay just a moment here to give you guys just a little bit more time to type in some questions. And in the meantime, I would just like to post up here, let's see, again, the compost schedule coming up. This is found easily on the Connecticut RC&D.org webpage, which Cheryl had shared with us earlier. Other ways to find it, we've got the easy registration click button here. That button will take you over to another one of our partners, Connecticut NOFA, which has been graciously helping with all the registration process. And then from there, let's see if I can get this quickly. Oh boy, come on. Well, shucks. From there, I'm sorry, there is also the DEEP webpage.
You have it tabbed right there.
I do, I just can't reach it. I'm sorry. Is that, oh goodness. I'm sorry. I can't seem to reach it quickly enough. But I'll work on getting that one. Oh goodness. All right. I lost my mojo. Sorry, we've got, I'll pull that back up. So in the meantime, please put those questions in there. And until then, Peter, we've got a quick question for you.
Okay.
Do you have any examples of small businesses, such as B&B, inns, retreat centers, elementary schools, or things like that, that could use aerated static piles to compost on-site at their facilities? And a two-part question, what would be some barriers or challenges for these types of institutions to put these in?
Okay, two-part question. I think the best example of an on-site system in a school scenario is at St. John's University in Queens, New York. They've been composting probably 6, maybe 7 years at this point, very, very successfully. The facilities manager, a fellow named Tom Goldsmith, is a huge proponent of managing his waste materials on site. Their finished compost is used in an on-site organic farm, which is managed by student volunteers. So that's one example. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to work with a middle school in Southern California. We donate, every year we donate one or two, I call them grant-funded projects, but we guide them through the process when the students are very, very instrumental in developing sustainable strategies on site. It's fun for me. And that's one that we did earlier. So yeah, we have a number of examples. In terms of barriers, I would say institutional commitment is the number one, where you need the people in the decision-making roles to be fully committed to this and moving forward, at least to test it in a pilot scale before implementing it on a large scale. And then also, I have one of my many rules is you cannot compost by committee. So you need 1 or 2 people who are really champions of this process for it to work. If you just stack yet another responsibility onto the facilities management people, likely it won't get done. But if you have somebody who is really committed to it and excited about it, it will work for them every time.
That is a fantastic answer. Thank you. Peter, we've had a question. Could you please share your screen one more time with your contact info on there?
You bet. I will try.
Okay, fair enough. We'll take that. And,
Okay.
and a quick reminder that these webinars, all 5 of these webinars are recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from the organizers with 2 things. 1, a link to these webinars, and 2, a follow-up survey. We'd be very grateful if you would please fill out that survey, offering any comments, feedbacks on what things you found useful, what things you were hoping would be involved, so that we can make these things better for you each time. So there you have it, O2 Compost from Peter Moon and his contact information.
Very good. Thank you. I'll close out of there.
So Peter, another question for you. How exactly are the timers used in your static aerated systems?
That's a great question. Generally speaking, we use simple on-off cycle timers. For the small systems, we got them online through greenhouse vendors, and there are 2 dials, one to dial the on time, the second to dial the off time. And a typical scenario for our smallest systems, our microvins, is about 30 seconds on every 30 minutes. That gets the process going. And as Andrew mentioned, if the pile temperature gets too hot, it slows the process down, and some undesirable things can happen. And so in that instance, we actually increase the airflow to mechanically displace the heat out of the pile, replacing it with ambient air, and thereby bringing the pile temperature back down into the desired range. So we typically will adjust the airflow not more than 2 minutes every 20 minutes. In some of our large systems, we may go 5 minutes every 15 minutes, but it's basically an on-off cycle 24 hours a day.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, another question that's just come in is, how would the aerated static piles be able to compost biodegradable plastics, such as utensils, plates, or other things? You may have
That's
just
a
answered
tough
the question
because every product out there that is said to be biodegradable isn't. Some are not. Some take longer than others. And it is like contamination, a challenge to the industry. And so ASP, because we're reaching high temperatures or can reach high temperatures, are well suited to breaking down these materials, but I won't say that's a universal truth. You really have to trial and error to see what works for you, whether you want to use those materials or not. Now, biodegradable cups and plates and things like that, yeah, no problem. But it's where you're getting into the plastic flatware where we can see some problems. Andrew, what's your take on that?
Well, I haven't had a lot of experience with close experience with operators that are composting those materials, but my sense has been exactly the same, that it's the thicker materials like a flatware that's the problem. And if you look at the AFCM standards for what is biodegradable, something can meet that AFCM standard and not necessarily in a typical pile go through the conditions by which it met the standard. That is to say, from what I've seen of the standards, you have to have it at a high temperature for a longer period of time than you might typically have in a typical system in order for them to become biodegradable. So I agree that it's a trial and error thing. Also, you know, from my perspective, talking to composters, composters have a really different take on compostable materials than do the people that are setting up curbside recycling programs. Essentially, they're a real benefit for people that are setting up the programs that essentially allow more material to be collected. It's especially the case with compostable bags. But then on the composting end, is anyone seeing something wacky go on with the?
Yeah, I do too.
Okay. On the composter end, it's often hard for the composter itself to recognize the difference between something that's compostable and something that's in there and is a contaminant. And that's especially true on the bag end, so that for facilities out west that have programs that are taking in plastic bags, they can't tell on the front end if the bags that they're getting are compostable bags or not, and they end up pulling them all out as much as they can anyway. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question, but I guess my experience is any type of compostable material can potentially be a problem for the composter.
One thing I can add to that, if you are an existing compost facility and you want to test some of these materials, get a large nylon mesh bag and fill it with your feedstock mix and add those materials to it. Throw it in the pile, bury it in the pile, let it go through the active phase and even the curing phase, and pull it out as a discrete sample and see what you have. And decide for yourself, is this something that works or not?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do remember, I don't know if Cedar Grove offers this to outside people. They had their own testing lab for determining, an on-site testing lab at Cedar Grove for determining things that they would consider compostable at their site versus not compostable.
I think that it may even be on, that may also be on their website. It's been a while since I've been to their website.
Yeah.
All right, great, thank you. Andrew, can we transition into you now with a few different questions?
Yep.
When you had mentioned food waste digestate, were you referring specifically to anaerobic digestate in your process?
Yep, that is correct.
Okay.
So we, as a company, we end up working with a fair amount of digestate coming from on-farm digesters that have a blend of manure and food waste that have digested that material and then land apply it.
Gotcha. Okay. There's a question asking about if you could provide a reference for some more nitrogen mineralization rates, the table that you had referenced in there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do have some. I'd recommend whoever it was to send me an email, and I can find the references. I can tell you that they come from essentially our own in-house blend of taking these numbers from different sources and averaging them. We also do some in-house mineralization trials. So we've sort of seen a range of different materials on digestates, compost, and manures as well. So it is painting some of those things with a broad brush. And so, for instance, compost, I have up there a year one nitrogen mineralization of 10%. So 10% of that organic nitrogen in year one, we're estimating would be converted to nitrate and ammonia to be available for uptake by plants. If you have a really nitrogen-rich mix in your compost and you're a facility that puts it out relatively quickly, it's likely that your mineralization is going to be somewhat higher than that. It's going to be lower than the manure would be on its own, uncomposted, but it'll probably be higher than that 10%. On the other end, if you have a material that's leaf and yard waste, and you haven't added any nitrogen to it, it's very possible that the final product, composted product, could have almost no nitrogen and might even suck up, immobilize some of the nitrogen in the soil when you add it to the soil. So it would show up, in theory, sort of like a negative number on your mineralization. So for compost in particular, it's hard to fit them all into one number. That 10% is sort of the average of the ranges that we've seen. The take-home message there on that slide was really that if you have a nitrogen-rich material and you compost it, you're going to reduce the amount of plant available nitrogen in that product that you end up adding to the soil.
Valuable info for sure. All right, moving on to another question. We have a question about size of scale. So related to the depackaging machine, how big of a facility would justify purchasing that type of equipment?
It's pretty big. Those are typically north of $500,000. So in your, essentially in your pro forma, you'd have to figure out what your return on investment is. I haven't seen them certainly haven't seen them on a small scale facility. You have to be pretty large before you get to the point that that's going to pay. But if you are considering being a large food waste composting operation, it's worth checking into what might be available, what feedstocks might be available to you if you did have a depackager versus if you didn't, because they're going to be higher paying feedstocks. But it's a significant cost.
It sounds like it. Yes, indeed. We have a question about the leachate. Could the leachate be used as a byproduct or a value-added product, such as a liquid feed, as opposed to handling it as a waste?
Yeah, it sort of depends on how you use it. You'd have to be more careful using it than you would compost itself. So, and Jim, I know you're familiar with that. That's based on leachate that you see from silage bunkers, which is really rich material, which can kill, whatever grass it goes down onto. It is going to be more dilute in terms of nutrients that might cause that burning than silage leachate, but and so you would see, say you had a system, some kind of liquid collection tank for the leachate, and you had the ability to apply that with a tanker, just like liquid manure, you would get some benefit from it. So you could, potentially use it beneficially, but it's not something I would necessarily put in bottles and put on a shelf like a compost tea, say.
Might want to do some testing first. See what some of the properties are.
Best to test.
Sounds good. Sage advice, no doubt. Andrew, there's a question asking if you could recommend any compost testing facilities, or perhaps which facilities do you like to use?
Well, so I got to ask you or Sherry, is it okay to recommend that, or would it be better as someone sending me an email? I don't want to. I do have strong opinions about where to send things.
Well, what if we started with the ones that you like to use, the ones that you see in front of you regularly, and if somebody would like additional info, we'll send them to you.
Yeah, it really depends on what you're getting analyzed. So for typical nutrient analysis, that works is going to be good enough. Oh, geez.
Did we just lose Andrew?
He's muted at this point.
Oh, here I am. My
battery's
low. Battery's low on my phone. This is bad timing. So for 90% of the testing that I do is nutrients, bulk density, or not even bulk density, nutrients, carbon, pH, things like that. I use the University of Maine, and they've been great. Their turnaround's a little slow. They're cost effective. I trust them quite a bit, and they're great with follow-up. So for those simple parameters, I highly recommend them. I'm sure there are other labs that are great, but I have a relationship with them, and no matter where I am in the country, I have people often send stuff to the University of Maine. When you get into more complex composting questions, like in some cases in California, we have to quantify the amount of physical contaminants that are in the material. Some cases doing bioassays to see if it's mature or if it has some sort of plant inhibition. I use control labs in Watsonville, California. They used to be called soil control labs, but their composting division is great. I like them a lot. And then when it gets into metals, organic contaminants, there's a bunch of different labs that I'll use depending on what it is specifically that I'm looking for.
That's fantastic. All right, thank you.
Yep.
We've got a couple more questions remaining. I'm gonna change this up just a little bit. There's a bigger question here. I'm gonna skip over to the easier question. Can compost be applied directly to garden beds, particularly over the winter? And is there a difference between a smaller compost system and a larger compost system in terms of product or concerns?
Andrew, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I was just plugging in my good charger. Sorry. So the question was, Jim, can you apply compost to a garden bed in the winter?
Yeah, can you apply compost directly onto garden beds at any time, particularly over winter? And then is there a difference between a compost product from a small system versus a large system? And
yeah, so that's a great question. In winter, you know, from a nutrient management perspective, I never recommend applying things in winter. And there was another question that sort of referred to that as well, just because you are apt to get a little more runoff, but it's safer to say apply compost in the winter to a garden bed than it would be commercial fertilizer or uncomposted manure if you were concerned about runoff. In terms of small systems versus big systems, I think that the real difference is how finished is the compost. If you have a very mature compost, which you can get in a backyard, you know, one bin composting system, you have a lot, it's a lot more forgiving than compost that is not quite mature. And so that's really, and that's not necessarily dependent on the size of the composting system. It's really dependent on how thoroughly the material has been both gone through that active phase and then the curing phase. There are some simple tests out there. The one that a lot of people use is called the Solvita test, which is a pretty quick, easy way to test for compost maturity. So no, it's, you know, if you have a big system, if we went back to the sort of early, one of the early things I mentioned about people being driven by tip fees versus being driven by high quality, you know, selling a really high-end material. It's not always the case, but it's typically going to be the case that someone that's focused more on that, you know, the high-end compost is going to have a compost that's more mature than someone that's trying to get it through the system sort of as quickly as possible.
There's a quick question on here. Andrew, do you follow the USCC standards, US Composting Council standards?
For testing?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay, that's a good question. When I did the video for the CCREF, one of the reasons they wanted to have the sampling video done was because the USCC, the TMEC standards that they have, that the USCC has put out for compost testing are a little hard to read through. They're a little overly complex and a little bit academic. And so we essentially tried to make a video that would make the sampling procedure a little easier. And the sampling guidance in there, which is typically the type of sampling that I'm doing, is mostly in compliance with the USCC TMEC standards. But there are some areas where the following TMEC standards to a T is cumbersome, and we don't do it. And then another question, another sort of topic related to that is that USCC has developed this seal of testing approval, the STA program. And I do have some farms and some composting operations that have become certified. I think it's called being certified through that process, where you test on a regular basis for all of the standards that are in the STA. Most of the people that I work with don't test that extensively because in addition to sort of the standard test that say the University of Maine would do that will give you nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, salt content, moisture content, pH. That one includes trace metals. It includes physical contaminants. It includes bioassays, and it's relatively expensive. So it sort of depends on if you feel like that's an important marketing tool for you to have that STA seal or not. Some people find it valuable, and most smaller operations, it's a relatively big expense, but it's a good program.
Okay, great to know. Peter, could I direct this question your way as well? Have you done any work related to looking at residuals in the composting? The question here is specifically related to worming medications from horse operations or other livestocks. What are you seeing in terms of residuals through the composting process?
I can answer that indirectly. I myself, coming out of the engineering end of things, am more aligned with the process and the procedures of composting, but I do work very closely with Washington State University, and specifically a gentleman named Andy Barry, who's a soil scientist who has done quite a bit of research on the fate of antibiotics and other compounds, worming agents, and so forth. And the answer is, well, yeah, most of them go away, but not everything goes away. And hopefully we don't get into the residual herbicide discussion because that'll take us way off track. But there are certain compounds that don't break down as readily as others. Are they a problem in the environment? As subject to, I guess, further research, discussion, opinion, and I personally don't have a solid answer on it. I'm mostly just repeating what people I consider experts in that area are telling me. So that's kind of a waffle answer. I'm sorry, but
That's all right.
Yeah.
Andrew, anything from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with Peter. I do follow this stuff very closely. It's, I work with such a wide range of materials, and I see different types of contaminants in different materials, and a lot of them don't necessarily break down in the composting process. And it's sort of the nature of using organic, our organic waste to build soil health. It's an imperfect system. We don't have chemical purity. We never will. So I typically trust risk assessments that are being done on these things. And we do have, several pretty good risk assessments. Typically, there are always going to be compounds that we don't know a whole lot about, but they're in there. I personally use residuals, all kinds of residuals, including biosolids compost in my own garden, knowing full well that they're not chemically pure, that they have some contaminants in it, but based on the research I've done and that I've seen, I guess more importantly, that I've seen peer-reviewed research, I feel comfortable with it. I think the idea of chemical purity, even if you have an organic compost, we know we're going to have residual pesticides in there. We know we're going to have, if you're collecting food waste, we know we're going to have some PFAS in there. It's sort of a dirty, messy system. There are some safeties that we have in the fact that soil itself is somewhat of a living filter, both biologically and physically. So it's my overall philosophy. It doesn't mean that everything is absolutely safe all the time. I'm a big fan of testing materials to ensure that they are below applicable standards before using them as feedstocks.
Excellent. It definitely leads into a lot of additional conversations when we open up that topic. But that was a fantastic starting point. So thank you both. All right, so we are winding down here. I'm not seeing too many more questions come in. However, there is one question that I'd like to use as a launching pad for our 5th webinar series on October 28th. The question was asked, what are the DEEP, or our state environmental requirements for starting composting business on a small scale? I'd like to use that question to seed for our webinar number 5 series, where we will have our very own Joe Wedeman presenting from DEEP, who works with a lot of our regulations related to water quality in the state on farms and these types of operations. So I'd love to encourage you to tune in for webinar number 5 and get the answer to that question. In addition, though, to Joe Wedeman presenting, there will also be some on-farm composting examples. I'm going to say demonstrations, but maybe some short clips from the farms, as well as on-farm conversations about what people are doing actively to compost their materials, some of the struggles and successes that they have worked with. And so all of that will be presented in our next webinar series. Andrew or Peter, any last minute thoughts for our audience out there based on some of the questions you've heard? And
go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I was just going to say I do encourage people that are considering composting to go ahead and try it out. You know, one of the picture that I showed a bunch of pictures from a facility called Dirt Huggers out in Oregon, and to me, they're such a great example of building organic or a composting program in an organic fashion. They literally started out as going from restaurant to restaurant in their town of Hood River with totes and picking up food scraps and lifting them by hand into a pickup truck and having very small piles. And now they're composting, I think, 65,000 tons per year, with a lot of that coming from Portland curbside collection programs. They did it slowly, but they literally started out just 2 people and a pickup truck and a location in an industrial park where they were able to make piles with it. But it is, you know, it's a fun operation. I do encourage you to look into, you know, do a good business pro forma. It's not an easy way to make money, but it is a very satisfying process.
I would add a couple things. Both Andrew and I have websites with a considerable amount of information on them. I would encourage you to read through both of those. And if you're thinking about getting into composting, one of my mantras is think big, start small. Play with it, learn by experience, build a market, test. There's a lot of things you can do for almost free, and decide for yourself whether this is something you want to pursue. It's not for everybody, but it is for a lot of people, especially if you are of a mind that sustainability matters. And to me, that's really the key to it is let's take a waste and convert it into a value-added product that we can take advantage of, or we can sell and market and so forth. And I think it's a viable niche for a lot of people. And I would encourage you to take action on it.
That's fantastic.
And I guess with that, I want to thank you also, the sponsors and everybody who's attending either in real time or after the fact for spending your time to hear what we have to say. And hopefully this gets you a little closer to taking action.
By all means.
Yeah. I'll just one final thing. I want to thank all the participants for listening, and this was fun for me. I didn't put up my contact information, but if anyone wants to contact me, Andrew Carpenter at Andrew at northerntilts.com.
Absolutely. All right. The lights are flickering over here. There's a little storm outside. So before I disappear, I just want to say a very sincere thank you to Andrew and to Peter. I can hear
You
the
bet.
applause in the background. Thank you very much. That's been fantastic. Thank you for your time, your energies, and all your wisdom. Audience, please don't forget that you will be receiving an email tomorrow with a follow-up survey. We would value your input on that. And along with that will be the links to watch this as well as the previous recordings. So with that, we will say thank you all very much and have a great evening.
Okay. So long.
All right, thanks. Bye.
Cheers.